Hello everyone, what's going on? My name is Mr. Pazaak and we're back to my story. Last time we left off, we were on the Matale grounds. I figured I shouldn't disturb them. I wasn't really here to mess with any of the settlers of Dantooine. I was just here to find what was in the grove and stop the dark side threat. Stop the corruption from spreading. But we decided to run around the house, make sure everything was clear. And then when we rounded another corner into the next area, we found a man bargaining with some Mandos. Apparently he owed them something. But the Duros were having the Mandos were having none of it. And the man was just gunned down. Though he did make sure to offer up his wife and child first. Couldn't feel too bad for the guy, but we still had to take care of the Mandalorian threat. It was a tough fight. Even just one Mandalorian is a pretty tough threat. But once we took out his Duros allies, and with Karth and Canderous providing fire support, we took him out without too much trouble. But we could at least confirm the reports that there were in fact Mandalorians on the planet. But with that threat taken care of, we decided to head into the next region, also known as the Grove. We were finally getting closer to our objective. But of course, for some reason, Canderous decided to stick around and check out the body of his felon Mandalorian. But with a step back on the top of the hill and shouted for him, he finally showed up. And just like that, we were off to the Grove. Almost immediately, we were beset upon by a bunch of Kathhounds, especially after I threw a frag grenade at one of them. As annoying as the creatures are, though, with two guys with big blasters at my back, I wasn't too worried. At the time, I wasn't as skilled as I would have liked. But I managed to deal with them. Luckily, Karth and Canderous were more than willing to provide the fire support, too. But after a quick search around the area, we didn't find anything that pointed to any sign of distress or anything causing the dark side corruption, so we knew we had to head west. But we saw a bridge with a man named Pazaak standing on it. Apparently, he was trying to figure out he was investigating a crime scene, basically being the closest thing the Jedi had to a detective. A man named Calder was found murdered, and two men, a man named Handon and a man named Rickard, were found at the scene of the crime. Pazaak had called for an information droid from the Jedi Council and was trying to determine which one of the two men had murdered Calder. First task he gave me, though, in an attempt to help train me, was to have me interrogate both men and find out what the heck they had been doing. Handon said that he had just been out for his run and had seen Rickard kill him, but Rickard said he was out hunting Iriaz on the fields, even though I hadn't seen any. The information droid assured me that there were, in fact, Iriaz out. However, we almost immediately caught Rickard in a lie when he tried to say that he was out, but the sun had gotten in his eyes. But, according to the droid, there was no sun, so boom, we had one lie against Rickard. Then Pazaak asked me to check with them about how they knew the victim.
Right.
Apparently, Rickard owned a business with him.
How can I be a friend?
But Handon apparently just kind of didn't really know him at all. Handon was like, I don't know the guy. And insisted that he had been out just doing a run. He was holding his side, which was a little strange, but it seemed like he was fine. He insisted it was just a cramp from running. But yeah, the droid confirmed Rickard and Calder owned a business together, but apparently Handon had actually rented a droid from Calder, a speeder from Handon a number of... Yeah, Handon had rented a speeder from Calder a number of times. But as far as a motive for murder, whether or not they knew each other was irrelevant. Rickard apparently had a rather public falling out fight with his business partner, Calder. Pazaak asked me if I could investigate the weapon found at the scene. But at the same time, he's foolishly admitted to actually wanting to kill the man for cheating, for cheating on Handon with his wife. But apparently, according to Handon, all he wanted was to punch his face in for that, nothing more. Rickard insisted he had no idea anything about the weapon found at the scene. But when we asked the droid about the actual blaster being stolen, as Handon had said, the droid insisted there was no report anywhere that it had happened. But Pazaak agreed. We did catch him in a lie, but then finally he asked us if we could find out about the blood sample. Yeah, apparently there had been a blood sample on the blaster found at the scene. But as always, the useless droid insisted that the lab had been contaminated, and there was no way to get the sample checked. So, it was just up to pure chance whether or not we were going to we had to just guess. All we knew is it wasn't Calder's blood. But, as Pazaak had mentioned, Handon was clutching his side, and when we pulled up his shirt, there was a blaster wound. Pazaak asked if we wanted to interrogate or blame Rickard, though, because apparently Handon had been shot. However, I knew the truth. I knew that they were both guilty. Pazaak agreed and took both men back to the Enclave for questioning. His story of events, which was probably pretty close to true, was that both men had come out to kill Calder. Handon had killed him, shown up first, but then, while he was standing over Calder's body, Rickard shot him thinking he was Calder. In a panic, Handon quickly called the Jedi. Yes? But when the Jedi showed up, we weren't merciful, and we knew they were both out for murder. Rickard for intent to murder and assault with a deadly weapon when he shot Handon, and Handon for actually killing Calder for cheating for cheating with his wife. But with that matter resolved, it was back to hunting Kath hounds and trying to get to the problem at the center of the grove. Luckily, we'd gotten pretty good at killing Kath hounds by this point. But while we were fighting, I happened to notice a few speeders in the distance. Unfortunately, they seemed pretty close to the model we'd seen the other Mandalorian group using. But thankfully, they didn't seem to react to us firing blasters and swinging lightsabers at all these Kath hounds, which was a minor miracle in and of itself. But after we managed to deal with the Kath hounds, we decided to prepare for battle a little more this time. Threw on some energy shields because we knew that the weapons the Mandalorians carried were probably pretty formidable. I even popped a few stims to try to help me take them down faster. And like that, we were off. This time we faced 2 Mandalorians and some Duros allies instead of just one. With a battle cry for Mandalore, the battle was joined. The Mandalorian in front with the double-edged sword engaged me immediately, but I proved to be more than a match for him. Then it was just down to one Mandalorian, and he didn't stand a chance. With Karth and Kandor as fire support, I took him down. We found data pads relating to a man named Sherrick. I wondered if this could be the leader that John had mentioned. Thankfully enough, we also found some strength gauntlets, which I decided to start using. Anything to help me swing harder. As much as I wanted to try out the Vibro double sword we found on the Mandalorian's body, I knew that I should carry my Jedi weapon with pride on Dantooine. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do that in the rest of the galaxy at these days. As we kept hunting Kath hounds, we eventually found a place in the edge of the grove. A small cluster of what looked like ruined structures. First, we had to get a few more Kath hounds out of the way. But once we did, I tried it using my new heal powers, and we headed over to the ruins. I sensed the dark side coming from within. As we stepped closer, a young woman stepped out. She wasn't human. She was something like a human. After thinking about it for a minute, I recognized her as a KOTOR. She stasised Canderous and Karth without a moment's hesitation, and then the battle was joined. She was wielding her own lightsaber very effectively, but I was more than a match for her. And just like that, after a few clashes, the battle was over. Apparently her name was Juhani. Apparently she had slain her Jedi Master, Katra. I told her that the Jedi Council had sent me here to stop her. Managed to convince her that actually the Jedi would take her back. Her greatest fear was that she had killed her master and would be chased away from the Jedi forever, but once I convinced her otherwise, she ran off back to the Jedi Council. I wasn't too sure, but I had a feeling that maybe I had done what was necessary to cleanse the taint from the grove. But before we headed back, I decided to keep exploring Dantooine. I figured there might be a little more in store for us. But as usual, Canderous seemed to be lagging behind and shaking off the last effect of his stasis, but just after that, we continued on. Almost immediately, we found another batch of Kath hounds roaming around. We decided to deal with them. These ones looked a little different, like they were older, tougher. But thankfully, we were still well armed and more than capable of taking them down. But shortly after entering what was marked off as the Sandal Grounds, we saw a cave. And the Force called to me from this cave, and we decided to enter. Master Jar had actually mentioned this Force Cave before we had headed out into the wilderness of Dantooine. But I had no idea that there would be actual creatures who had been drawn to it, just as I had. We found a bunch of Kinrath hanging out inside, and Canderous was actually poisoned. But I knew that the effects weren't too bad, and we decided to keep pressing forward. A perhaps poorly timed grenade sent most of the Kinrath inside the cave into a frenzy. But we were up to the challenge. And just like that, we were amongst the crystals. I had never seen anything like it before. It wasn't just that the crystals were pretty, they seemed to exude their own soft echoes into the Force. They called to me on some deeper level. Thankfully, after a time, we've managed to punch through all the Kinrath that were in our way. We came across an incredibly large concentration of Kinrath eggs. And while I had no desire, I couldn't sell them or anything, and they weren't worth anything in Pazaak, but I knew that these Kinrath eggs represented a threat to the settlers of Dantooine, and I had to take care of it. Just because I wanted to take their money in Pazaak didn't mean I didn't care about these people. I also found something more dangerous than Kinrath in many of the eggs. Found red lightsaber crystals inside of them. I didn't know why there were so many of these dark crystals within the cave. Maybe the Kinrath decided to host each one of their young off of one of these red crystals for some reason. Or even more insidiously, the Kinrath eggs turned some of the local crystals into red Sith crystals. Either way, I knew that these couldn't stay here. So I took it upon myself to break every egg I could. There were quite a few eggs. We were fairly covered in goo by the time we managed to leave the cave. We also found a Mandalorian corpse inside. Apparently the Kinrath had dragged him inside the cave. Tenacious little guys. But we decided not to take all the crystals from the cave. This cave should be open to all Jedi. And we knew that it was wrong to take every crystal. But upon leaving the cave, I felt I had gained more insight. As well as Canderous, he admitted to feeling somewhat touched by what he had felt within the cave. But after everything, Canderous seemed to be at the point where he might actually be able to handle the destabilizer that we had found. And I was eager to test that out, so once we left the cave, I decided that it was time to head back to the Jedi Council and tell them that we had rescued Juhani, assuming she hadn't beaten us back there. And just like that, we were back outside the Ebon Hawk. It had been nice to take a quick rest after seeing the Jedi, or after rescuing Juhani from her own darkness. But we quickly ran over and talked to the Jedi, eager to hear how they had felt my third and final major trial had gone. But first, I wanted to see what had happened if Canderous could handle the destabilizer. A truly immensely powerful ionic weapon. And so it was that Canderous Ordo took one of the strongest weapons we had ever found. Destabilizing droids, people, anything in its path. Although I was certainly a Jedi Sentinel, I knew I wanted to carry a blue saber. Something about the collar called to me.
It is good to go to Master.
When we tried to report to Master Vandar, he told us that Master Jar was the man we needed to tell about completing our trial with Juhani.
You have done.
He was very happy to tell us that Juhani had successfully come back to the light, and that my final test had been completed. Now I was encouraged to talk to Master Vandar. Master Vandar decided to encourage me to take Bastila with me to investigate the ruins that Malik and Revan had investigated so long ago. It was good to have her with me again, finally. She had learned much during her time with the Jedi Council, staying back at the Enclave while we had gone out.
What can I do?
I decided to give Bastila the Jedi robes for the time, although it was I could feel that the tightness of the armor restricted some of my more elaborate force powers. I knew that it was worth it for the protection at the time. I made sure to check on Juhani before we left.
You have done.
Yes, what's that?
Belaya also decided to mention the fact that, you know, oh, maybe we hadn't done such a horrible job in rescuing Juhani. You know, never one willing to give any praise, that one. While we had been with the Jedi Council, though, Mr. Sandal, head of the Sandal estate, had asked us if we could, or had, rather persuasively asked the Jedi to intervene into the matter of his missing son, who he suspected had been kidnapped by, the Matale family. While this accusation seemed rather ridiculous, there was no way we could prove whether or not this had happened until we actually got out and talked to the Matale family at their estate. What I meant to say was Alan Matale had accused the Sandal family of kidnapping his son. Sorry, you know, this memory. Sometimes I forget how these things went.
You asked me if I think things could have been different.
Karth chose the time while we were wandering around on Dantooine to ask Bastila about Revan. But we decided to... I figured I should head back to the Matale grounds for a short moment before interrogating the Sandal family. Plus, I wanted to make sure that the grove was still clear after Juhani had left. And lo and behold, more Kathhounds had decided to move in on the area. A bunch of horned Kathhounds. Thankfully, with Bastila on our side, we were pretty quick in dispatching them. Unlike Canderous with his large rifle, Bastila was very adept at just locking them down. But when we returned to the Matale grounds, we saw something very unfortunate. We saw some Kathhounds standing over the body, over a settler's body. And when we investigated, we found a journal indicating that it belonged to Cassius Sandal. But before we could read more into it, we were accosted again by yet more Kathhounds. But now we had the proof we needed, the proof to show Mr. Sandal that his son was dead. After all, when Mr. Matale had come to the Jedi Council, he had told them that according to Mr. Sandal, Mr. Matale had kidnapped or killed his son. But we now had evidence to the contrary. Cassius had clearly been killed by Kathhounds in the fields near the Matale estate. We moved as fast as we could, but we still had to deal with the constant appearance of Kathhounds along the way. Even the Jedi cave that we had just cleared a minute before already had a new Kathhound on the prowl. But thankfully we were somewhat prepared. But suddenly we stumbled upon the largest group we'd seen yet of Mandalorians. And multiple Doros warriors. But after a few diplomatic frag grenades, we had opened up on them. Bastel was on force duty at the time, and she was just laying down some heavy power that the Mandalorians simply couldn't handle. I was glad Canderous wasn't here. I didn't want him to see too much of us, you know, basically slaughtering his former men. Even though he would constantly talk about how he didn't care and how it was part of the Mandalorian way of life, it seems impossible to believe that he truly didn't care whatsoever. Thankfully, the Mandalorians had a bunch of equipment on them that was worth taking at the time. But as soon as we left the Mandalorians behind, we found more Kathhounds, including an incredibly strong and rare albino Kathhound. I had never seen anything like it before. Funny enough, even though it was clearly an albino, it was also out during the middle of the day, so maybe albino Kathhounds have more constitution than other Kathhounds or something. I couldn't be sure. But once the albino was out of the way, we were ready to continue, and we headed over to the Sandal estate to tell him about his son. Same as the Metales, he had a droid waiting outside, although this one was definitely not a military model. Droid told me that Master Sandal wasn't supposed to be disturbed unless we had news of his son, and that I did.
have been informed. Kathhound?
Typical.
I must plead. We have nothing further to discuss. Please.
Even though I brought news of his son's death and gave him his journal back, gave him his son's journal, Mr. Sandal just immediately dismissed us as if we were nothing. But before we turned to leave, a young woman came out of the center of the house and greeted us.
My name is Rahasia.
Apparently her name was Rahasia, and apparently she knew that Shen Matale had been kidnapped and was being held in the house.
The jet.
Rahasia asked us to actually break into the rear section of the house and free Shen to try to stop this feud between their fathers. I could tell from the way she talked about him that she might have grown a little bit fond of Mr. Matale. But it was unimportant. As soon as we entered the back of the house, a bunch of sentry droids descended on us, but they were no massive match for us.
Ready.
But since Rahasia hadn't exactly been clear on where Shen was, we had to start exploring on our own. And unfortunately, the very first door we opened just led to more sentry droids. But we quickly dispatched them. Thankfully, it didn't seem like they were hooked up to any major alarm system. There was, however, a nice spikeable computer. And it thankfully gave us the chance to overload a power conduits inside the house and clear the way from some of the sentry droids that were in our way. Sadly, we had to destroy a droid it would have been nice to hack, but considering that we didn't want to leave a live droid in the house, it seemed like it was a better plan to just take out many of the droids that were on guard duty and try to reduce collateral damage. After all, we weren't here to take over the house. We were here simply to free Shen Matale.
No problem. Got it.
But at the same time, family seemed pretty well off. So, you know, we took maybe a few things. Look, I'm Mr. Pazaak. I do what I want, okay? I don't have to explain anything to you. Play me in Pazaak if you don't like it, huh? I'll beat you. Anyway, regardless of how I still have my game after all these years. After a short time exploring the house, we actually found Rahasia's room. But we still failed to locate Shen Matale. until we went back to where we had originally come in.
No problem.